Good morning, everyone, and welcome to OETC and Microsoft's M365 webinar series. Today's session will cover getting started with Azure Active Directory for IT admins and will be presented by Ryan Burns, Account Technology Strategist on the Education team at Microsoft. This session is being recorded and will be sent out later this week. There'll be time for Q&A at the end, but feel free to add any questions to the chat throughout the webinar. For those just joining, go ahead and make sure you hit yourself on mute.
I mean, because their cameras are down too. Yeah.
Just a reminder, all those attending, go ahead and make yourself on mute. Great, thank you so much. And as a quick reminder, we have added a new webinar for July 13th. This will cover integrating your LMS and SIS with M365. The details can be found in the email you received this morning from OETC. I'll take a quick moment, as always, also to highlight OETC's renewals team, some of whom are on today's webinar. If you have any licensing questions, you can reach out to help@oetc.org, and someone from the team will be happy to assist you. With that, Ryan, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Stephen. Hi, everyone. My name is Ryan Burns. I am an account technology strategist based in Texas that works for the U.S. Education team. Prior to working at Microsoft, I spent pretty much my entire professional career working at Texas A&M University in College Station, where I served lots of different roles, starting from a entry-level technician through help desk manager and into cloud strategy and adoption manager as well. So I've seen the gambit and I understand what is pressing for the educational world. Today, we're really going to be diving into Azure Active Directory specifically. I don't have any slides. This is really just going to be a live walkthrough of the Azure AD environment. And we're going to cover a lot. So we're going to stick to high-level concepts and then dive in relatively deep into some areas that are top of mind for most IT professionals when they're looking at getting into Azure AD for the first time. Before we go into the actual portal, though, I do want to start with just a few concepts to know when it comes to Azure Active Directory. Some of this may be repetitive for some of those that are a little bit more mature in their Azure AD journey, but for those of you that are brand new or don't have an Azure AD presence, I think it'll be helpful to at least establish that baseline. So give me 1 second while I share my screen. Okay, so the first screen that I have up right now, and all of these links I will make sure that you have access to after the webinar is done so that you can reference them yourself. And I try to make sure it's all content that is easily accessible. So when you are moving towards adopting any of the technologies we're talking about, you have a path moving forward of how to start the adoption process. I know that renewal season is coming up, so I wanted to at least share out our M365 education specific licensing to help, one, inform what we're going to be talking about here shortly, but then two, as a resource for those institutions that may be at that A3 level and looking to go into that A5 security route, or maybe upgrading to Azure AD Premium P2. So this is a great document because on the far left, you'll see A1 and then A3 in the middle and then A5 at the right. And then these are our main rows that we like to include or bundle all of our different services into. So you have Office 365 across the top, Enterprise Mobility and Security here, and then Windows 10 is the green at the bottom. It's probably small on your screen. I'll zoom in here in a second. Today, we're going to be focusing on Azure AD Premium Plan 1, which falls underneath that A3 level. And I'll be sure to call out anything that is in here that is, again, specific to A3. Things that we're going to be talking about are going to be around conditional access, Azure AD Connect, MFA, how to use advanced security and reports to better understand your environment. But there is also a component, Azure AD Premium Plan 2, which is part of either the A5 step-up licensing or part of the A5 security SKU. This is where we really get into those critical understanding of what's happening in your environment and providing just-in-time access. So this is where access reviews, privileged identity management, Azure identity protection, even risk-based conditional access start playing a role. But again, you can see on this document, it's not only Azure AD Premium. You can use this to understand anything that exists within our A5 security, A5 compliance, and A3, and even A1. All of these links are clickable and will take you directly to our documentation page over that specific area. So if you are trying to figure out what are your priorities for the next year when it comes to securing your environment or jumping into the Azure AD realm, or even just deploying M365 more, this is a great resource because, again, it not only illustrates what you have access to, but it also illustrates or it gives you the links to be successful in that area. So I'll make sure you have this afterwards. Wanted to call out those two areas that we'll be talking about. The next area that I think is a good place to just establish a baseline understanding is going to be Azure Active Directory Connect, or Azure AD Connect. At its heart, Azure AD Connect is what makes Azure AD work. So everyone most likely is using an on-premise Active Directory environment. That is where your user accounts are created, your groups are created, your devices are housed, and that is where you most likely are divvying out access to things on-premise and even in the cloud, like file shares, maybe even security group access. What Azure AD Connect does is it connects your on-premise environment to Azure AD through the use of a very lightweight client that's called the Azure AD Connect client. This client, you can deploy it to a server in your environment, and it connects and talks directly to your domain controller, and then communicates changes made to your domain or to your Active Directory environment to Azure AD, and synchronizes, or it can synchronize users, groups, devices, and even passwords. All of those settings are configurable to you through the Azure AD Connect Sync application. And there's a varying number of configurations you can use. Some people choose to just do users and groups. Some people choose to do users, groups, and devices. Some people only do users. It really depends on what you are going to be using Azure AD for. It is important to note that if you are interested in using a tool like Intune for device management, you will need Azure AD Connect to also sync devices, because those devices need to be populated into your Azure AD environment for Intune to start managing them. So this document that I have up is going to be a general guide for what Azure AD Connect is and the different components of it. This is a great resource to help you understand, again, at a base level, what it is. And then I'll also send along this document. This one specifically goes into detail about cloud authentication types. So now that you have your users and groups and maybe devices synchronized to the cloud, now you can start leveraging Azure AD for your cloud authentication. So authenticating to Google, authenticating to your HR platform, authenticating to other enterprise level SSO apps. As long as it's running SAML 2 and it's using or some form of modern authentication, most likely you can use Azure AD as your authentication source and allow users to authenticate off of Azure AD to avoid having the typical on-premise connection needed, or running into or setting up your own CAS authentication service that is usually a little time consuming. So there's a few different routes you can take. The first one is Azure AD password hash synchronization. This one specifically synchronizes the password hash to Azure AD. So you don't have to deploy any additional infrastructure to your on-premise environment. It synchronizes the password hash through the Azure Active Directory Connect tool, and then your users are able to log into any number of web-based applications through Azure AD. So it would be the same login portal that you would see in front of M365 in front of all of your other web-based applications. Azure AD pass-through authentication is another route that you can take that is very similar, but instead of the password hashes being synchronized to Azure AD, the hashes are not, and it actually leverages one, but we recommend 3 clients installed on several different servers in your environment that act as the password synchronization tool. So requests come in, say, hey, I want to authenticate, and it passes the credentials through to that application. And again, hashes are never stored. The other one that I'm not going to talk too in depth about, but it is ADFS, or Active Directory Federation Services. That is something that you can use in Azure, and there is towards the bottom of this document a diagram for how that would set up. But I really like this document specifically because a lot of those options are either new to you or you don't really know which route to take. And we do have a simple, I will say simple, but it is a decision tree that can help you understand what I should do or which tool I should leverage based on my environment or based on what type of environment I want to provide. So you can start at the start and answer a few basic questions, and it'll tell you which option to take. Further down in this document, I think not only does it have the use cases, the user experiences, considerations for each type, towards the bottom, it has architecture diagrams. So this is where it actually describes for you, again, in simple terms, but helps wrap your mind around how to leverage each one of the different password authentication processes that is available to you. So you have all three, including federation, which again relies on a federation server and a federation proxy. The pass-through relies on authentication agents, and then the password hash identities are synced via Active Directory Connect, so there isn't additional infrastructure needed. So I just wanted to talk briefly about Azure Active Directory Connect, the password authentication methods that you can leverage, because all of that plays a really important role in how you then configure Azure AD or how you interact with Azure AD moving forward. So now I'm going to jump into Azure AD. So if you're familiar with Azure AD, this should all look very familiar to you. However, if you're not, this is the Azure Active Directory Administration Center. You can get to it a few different ways. The one that I see most people going to is you log into your Office 365 Administration Center, and on the left panel, there's links to all of the different admin centers. And one of those is the Azure AD admin portal. That will link you over to this location. Another way to access it is through the aad.portal.azure.com link. And then the final one is going to be logging in through Azure proper, where all of the cloud-based services are, like VMs and machine learning and different services you can spin up. There is a link that will take you to the Azure Active Directory portal. All of those will take you to the same space, and they'll all have you land on the dashboard. This dashboard, if you don't mess around with it, is very generic. However, you can edit this dashboard to be more or provide you with information that is necessary and gives you an idea of what's happening in your environment. That can be done simply by going to edit and selecting the information that you want to show up, and then customizing the size. You can remove, you can add tiles, you can make them larger or smaller, and add as many as you want. Once you're done customizing, you also have the ability to download a template, a JSON, and then that template can be uploaded by someone else by coming here and going to upload. So if you are the main Azure AD admin and you are onboarding some of your other colleagues into this environment, and you want to make sure that they have a seamless kind of templatized experience when they log in, you can have them upload your customized dashboard, and then they will see everything that you see. The other important areas of the admin center are going to be on the left-hand side, where you see the pane or the blade, as we like to call it. This blade, right off the bat, will most likely for you, if it's your first time logging in, just list dashboard, all services, and Azure Active Directory. If I go to all services, this is where you will see all of the services that are offered within Azure AD. If you're familiar with the Azure portal, it is very similar. That is also where you would see all of your different services within Azure. This is specifically to Azure AD. So you'll notice there's nothing involving VMs, there's nothing involving virtual gateways or anything like that. This is specifically Active Directory-based information. You'll notice that I, underneath all services, have a whole bunch of favorites. All of these favorites I put onto my favorites dashboard or my favorites blade by simply selecting the stars. And these are the areas that we're going to cover today, so I selected and put them there. If I wanted to add more, it's as simple as hitting a star, and if I wanted to remove it, you would hit the star again. Once they're over here, you can drag and drop them and move them around to put them in whatever order makes the most sense to you. So once you start getting into Azure AD, it's a lot easier to just start adding items to favorites. If those are ones you're going to a lot, I think users, groups, and roles in administration is the top 3 that most people pin because it's something you're going to be going to over and over again. But I'm going to jump directly to Azure Active Directory, and you'll notice that another pane opened up, and it's starting me on the Contoso is my domain. It's a demo environment, and it's starting me on the overview pane. You'll notice that I have another blade that popped out. And you may even notice that there's some similarities. There's users here and users here, groups and groups. Those will take you to the same place. So if you don't want to use favorites, or if you haven't set any favorites, you don't have to constantly be going to all services and then finding whatever you need. They will be listed underneath Azure Active Directory, and you can easily find them here if that's more comfortable for you. So before I jump into showing you a lot of these areas, I do want to call out 2 important things. First, this is a demo tenant for me. So I do have users, I have groups populated, but I do not have this connected to an on-premise AD environment because I don't have an on-premise Active Directory environment. So everything you're going to see is going to be cloud-based. I will try to talk as much as possible about how this would look with an on-premise footprint as well, but just know that it is cloud-based only. Secondly, my licensing is going to be A5. So some of the things that you will see in here may not be available to you if you do not have A5 licensing. I will do my best to call out all of those items, but again, this is where this document really comes in hand, because you can see exactly what's available to you within Azure AD here if you're at A3, and what the step up to A5 or the Azure AD Premium Plan 2 feature would include. If you already have just this component or security, everything that I'm about to show you, you will see in your Azure environment as well. So the first thing I want to call out is going to be how we divide up Azure Active Directory. You'll notice we have manage, monitoring, and towards the bottom, troubleshooting and support. For manage, this is where you're going to be spending the majority of your time when it comes to doing actual things. Monitoring is where you're going to go for any type of logs, any type of sign-ins, risky users, usage and reports, all sorts of log-based diving in and understanding what's happening in your environment. That will be under monitoring. But I'm going to start just at the top and start going through some of the areas that, again, I think is going to be most important. So first, we talked about AD Connect. We talked about the different authentication methods for AD Connect. There is a section called AD Connect within Azure Active Directory that you can click on to go see the health of your environment, to see what type of authentication you're using, and it can be found right here, or I've pinned it to my left-hand favorites bar. So jumping in here, you'll notice I don't have anything synced. Again, I don't have an AD, on-premise AD, but this is where you'll see things like what type of sign-in is allowed. Is it ADFS? Is it seamless sign-on? Or do you have seamless sign-on set up? Is it pass-through authentication? I notice I don't have the tool installed, but it gives you the link to download and install the Azure AD Connect tool. You'll also notice that there's health and analytics. Because I don't have one, you don't see any information there, but if we were to go here, it would take us to the health of Azure AD Connect. The sync agent runs all the time. I believe it's every 2 minutes. So if it ever fails, you will get notifications. It will tell you exactly what accounts failed, what reason it failed for, and you're able to go and remedy those issues. So really great tool once you set up your Azure AD Connect environment to get disconnected to your on-premise environment. Just know that this exists, and this will show you exactly what is being synced, how it's being synced, and then actually have links to documentation if you want to start setting things up in a certain way. The next thing that I want to call out is going to be users. And we're going to jump straight into users because that's really the first place that everyone starts. And give me a second. I'm just going to check chat, make sure there aren't any questions over what we just talked about. Okay, so first question, Scott, how do you deal with? So you actually have the ability to set your default domain, and you can have that set to something other than whatever it is that you use. So I'm assuming you might have something at or something.edu, and you might use something differently. So one thing that's important is you can import domains into Azure Active Directory just like you can with M365. Actually, it would be the same domain. But if it is still different, you do have a way of flagging a specific domain as the primary domain, even if it is differing than the Azure Active domain that you're seeing. Matthew Spears, great question. No, I don't think that Azure AD will ever become the full replacement for on-premise AD. However, we have Microsoft Identity Manager, and I believe that we will be moving more of our identity management, so more of that IAM, ILM services from on-premise into the cloud. I always think that there will be an on-premise Active Directory footprint, but more and more services and more features and capabilities will be moved into the Azure AD realm. Great questions. And at the end, again, I'm going to shoot for about 10 minutes, 15 minutes for some Q&A towards the end. So feel free to put some more questions in the chat. Or if you want follow-ups on either one of those questions, we can talk about it then as well. So users, again, you'll notice my users are not directory sync. These are not on-premise users, but this is where all of your users, if you were syncing Azure AD environments, syncing your Azure or your on-premise AD environment to the cloud, this is where you would see all of your users populating. So right off the bat, you'll notice we have all users, we have deleted users, password reset settings, user settings for the whole, not just user settings specifically, and then a listing of users. Here you can do bulk operations, bulk creating users, bulk inviting, bulk deleting. Again, if you're syncing your on-premise Active Directory, you don't really have a need for creating users because you'll be still having the process that you have already for your on-premise Active Directory to create new users. And whenever a new user is created, it will be synced to Azure Active Directory. However, having a few cloud-based global admins or cloud-based help desk admins is a great idea because one, if something catastrophic happens on premise, you still have the ability to log into Azure Active Directory with those cloud-based accounts. From here, you'll notice there's a per user MFA. We'll talk about that later, but do know that you have the ability to get to a per user MFA style for some of the A1 licensing accounts because that is licensed or deployed a little differently, and we'll talk about that towards the end. Specifically here, I'm going to click into one of these accounts, Adele, and you'll notice that now we start seeing more information about Adele's account specifically. So on the previous page, it was all users, all up, and all the settings there. This is now getting into Adele's specific account information. So right off the bat, it's going to load your profile, and if you have the ability for password write back and password synchronization, you have the ability to reset a password. You also have the ability to edit this account. And again, if you're coming at this from a on-premise AD, your editing ability might be limited depending on what type of flags you have set in the Azure AD Connect tool. So this is also where you'll see job information, company name, employee ID, any of that information you're syncing from on-premise will show up here. Additionally, we have authentication contact information, so you can configure authentication methods that people have to sign up for when they're creating these accounts, and those would show here. And the final option is minors and consent. So we have specific ways of if someone is flagged as a minor in your system and you have a consent form to access specific applications, that information can be transferred into Azure Active Directory, and then based on that information, they can either be granted or prevented from having access to certain web applications. A great example would be you have a Google Apps environment and you only want someone to be able to access Google Apps if they're a minor, if they have parental consent. You can start setting a lot of those definitions and a lot of those guidelines by leveraging minors and consent information. You'll also notice we have revoke sessions, which means that you can revoke any logged in currently active sessions that this person has, and then maybe revoke sessions and then do a password reset if you're starting to see some specific user activity. Jumping ahead, you'll see we have assigned roles. This is where if this user was assigned a specific role within Azure Active Directory, it would show up here. Typically, what we recommend, just like in an Active Directory, on-premise Active Directory environment, we recommend assigning roles to security groups and then assigning users to those security groups, because best practice then allows you to really quickly remove a user from groups and not worry about having to go through each individual role. However, Azure Active Directory does present all this information to you right here. So very quickly, you can come and see what types of roles Adele has and what type of membership it was granted. So you'll notice, as an example, she was granted Global Reader directly. However, her guest inviter role was given to her because she's a member of a specific group. Other things you'll notice on here that are going to be A5 level, Azure Active Directory or Azure AD Premium P2, are going to be eligible assignments and expired assignments. This starts bringing in what we call privileged identity management or privileged access management, PIM/PAM. This is how you start doing just-in-time access to specific things. So you can give them specific assignments for a specific amount of time, or grant them access to a specific group for a specific amount of time that then gives them access to something. So this is a great way. Someone may email you saying, hey, I need access to insert whatever security group or whatever web application. You can make sure they only have access for a specific amount of time. Really great feature available in Azure AD. Jumping through where you've started deploying something called administrative units. think of administrative units as an OU that exists within your on-premise AD. It's not a one-to-one copy, but it's a pretty good way of starting to think about it. With an administrative unit, you have the ability of giving someone scoped access to a specific administrative task. So say you are a K-12 and you have a lot of satellite campuses that have their own field IT staff. And you want that field IT staff to have administrative privileges, but you don't want them to have administrative privileges for other locations. What you can do is you can create an administrative unit that then grants permissions or grants them permissions to administer a specific group of users. It is important to note that as of right now, users and groups are the only two that can be deployed in administrative units, not devices, but that is on the horizon. But a really cool thing, this is where you could check to see if someone has access to an administrative unit and how you can assign a user to an administrative unit to manage. You can also see groups. This is all of the different groups, both M365 groups and security groups that this user is a member of, and we'll talk about groups here in a little, but this is somewhere where you can jump in really quickly and just see a listing of all of the different groups. Applications, so if you have web applications deployed in your environment through enterprise applications, which is something we'll talk about, this is where you can start deploying that in, or where you can see what applications a user has access to. Licensing, you can deploy licensing on a per user basis. However, you can also use groups to deploy licensing, and we'll talk about that when we get to groups. But this is where you can check to see what type of license someone is assigned, and again, whether it's assigned directly or whether it's assigned by a group. Devices, I don't have any devices. However, if I did, this is where you'd see the devices that this user has logged into. And then it will give you all of the information about that device. So if you have Intune, you can quickly jump to a specific user and see exactly which devices they've logged into, what operating system it is, what type of join it is. Is it a Azure AD registered? Is it Azure AD joined? Is it hybrid? And whether or not the device is compliant register and what the activity is. Azure role assignments. This is going to talk specifically about Azure. I'm going to call it Azure proper, but it's Azure services. So you may have subscriptions or management groups and VMs and resource groups that live in Azure. You can see under a specific subscription, if you have this, if you have Azure services, what this person specifically has access to in Azure. So it's a great one-stop shop. Instead of having to jump over into Azure and go through identity access management to understand who has what access, you can see all that information here. And finally, authentication methods. This will show you what authentication methods have been set up for this user. This is also where you can revoke MFA sessions and require a re-register to MFA to force them to put this information back in to make sure it's up to date. This is also a location where you can see sign-in and audit logs specific to a user. So before I mentioned, you can see all sorts of sign-in logs and all sorts of audit logs for your entire environment. You can come to a specific user and see specific information for this person. And that's a trend that you'll see across groups as well in administrative units. You have the ability to dive in and kind of narrow that field. So if you know a specific user was having some interesting sign-in and you're trying to figure out specific information about a user, you can find them in your users tab and jump directly to their activity instead of trying to narrow it down from the broad view down. So if I jump back over to users, the other areas that I wanted to talk about are going to be password reset, and this is going to be the password reset properties for your Azure AD environment all up. So if you have password write back enabled, which is right here on-premise integration, I don't. But if you had this turned on, this is where you could start allowing users to do things like self-service password reset, enabling it or enabling it only for a select group of people, updating the type of authentication methods and the number of methods required to set up. So, you know, when they are going to do SSPR, they have the option to send the code to a mobile phone or give them a call over a mobile phone or email, answer security questions. This is where you can turn on all of that information. This is also where you can require people to register for password reset and how many days they're going to be asked to reconfirm that information. So 180 days is default. However, you can do more often if you want to make sure that that data is staying up to date. And then you can also customize the password reset information by providing a help desk link for further assistance if they need so. So I want to dump back over to users. The last thing is going to be user settings. This is very specific settings that you can configure. The first one is whether or not you allow just users to register applications. So giving users the ability to register a homegrown app into your environment for people to authenticate to. Some people say yes. Usually in education, we see this set to no. The administration portal, so you can restrict access to this portal to only people that have a global admin or an administrative role of some kind or a reader role of the admin center. Good practice, right? Not that a random person or a random user in your environment would have access to see much, but from a privacy and data concern, restricting that access to only those that you have granted the ability to see that is a good audit control. And then the last thing is going to be LinkedIn account connection. So whether or not you allow people to use their Microsoft account or these accounts in Azure AD to sync to LinkedIn or log in with LinkedIn. Other than that, this is again where you can see sign-in activity across all of your users instead of specific users. And this is where you can start customizing the date, how long, how many months, and it's add more filters if you want to narrow that down as well. Looking over into the chat, I see that we have 2 questions. We have a handful of users already in the Azure Directory, but don't have a sync tool installed. Okay, so Craig, great question. So if those are cloud-based accounts, nothing will happen. They will continue to exist in your cloud environment. If they are somehow on-premise accounts that have been synced, they will be updated to the correct information if the IDs match, right? If the UPNs are the same, they will be synced, so that account would be updated. So I think good practice here would be for you to go through, and if it's not an actively used account, I would recommend removing that and starting fresh. But again, cloud-based accounts wouldn't be affected by that. We currently manage Azure licenses, use PowerShell. Is there a way to set up and float it? Yeah, so we're actually about to get to groups, and I think that's the best way to assign licenses, and it's via groups. So jumping in, the next area I wanted to talk about, Matthew, I think will be of interest, is going to be groups. By default, when you go to the groups menu, you're going to see all of your groups, and groups are going to be security groups, M365 groups, on-premise synced groups. You'll notice that, again, all mine are source cloud. You would have source on-prem as well. This is where you will see all of your groups. And so these groups can be used in a lot of different ways. M365 groups are mainly going to be the collaboration groups. These are going to be the teams, right? So if you're using Microsoft Teams and someone creates a team or you create a team for someone, it will have an M365 group associated with it. It'll have an email address associated with it. But the important part to note is with groups, with M365 groups, you are not able to add roles to that M365 group, and they can't contain anything other than users. It's important because a security group, on the other hand, can be users, groups, and devices. So important distinction there. So if we jump in, I'm going to see the best way to describe the licensing. We're going to jump straight into just creating a new group because I think that'll answer some of the licensing questions. So with a new group, you have the ability to pick between security and M365 when you're creating a group from Azure Active Directory. Specifically, you would give the group a name. I'm going to select security specifically because we're talking licensing. However, if I was to select M365, you'll notice I also have the ability to generate an email address. So for security, Azure AD roles can be assigned to this group, yes or no. That's important, and I'll show you why here in a sec. So you have 3 different types of memberships. You have assigned, where you as an admin have to directly assign someone to it. And then you have dynamic user and dynamic device. Dynamic user, if I was to select this, you'll notice we have queries. Now you can start adding specific users. So what we're going to do is job title contains, we're going to do student, just to illustrate how a dynamic group works. We'll do that, and then I want to show you a neat feature. So now I can go and actually validate this. So I can add users and say, okay, I want to see some test users, see if any of these people that I'm selecting will they be added to this group dynamically? And the answer is 3 of them will and 3 of them will not. And I can click view details on why. This user job title does not contain student, it contains principal. So really quick way to validate the rules you're creating. This is a simple one, obviously. You can add custom extension properties, you can add other expressions and really start building out a pretty dynamic membership rule. But once you create that, I'm going to discard that rule. There we go. So once you create that rule, make sure you also assign owners. But if I switch this Azure AD roles can be assigned to the group to yes, you'll notice the only thing I can do is assigned. This is important because you cannot create a dynamic group and have it assign Azure AD roles. The reason being is security. We don't want a dynamic rule to be created that isn't perfect and it adds people to a global admin role or it adds people to a help desk admin role and all of a sudden random people discover they're able to reset passwords. So if you're going to be doing a security group that has Azure AD roles assigned to it, you have to deliberately add and remove people from, you have to deliberately add people to it. However, you can use things in Azure AD Premium P2 like access reviews to make sure that access to that group is being controlled. So every 60 days, the owner of that group has to go through and say, yes, these people are still all global admins or all help desk administrators, or no, I need to remove these few people because they're no longer in this role or no longer need access to that. You can also do the reverse and have users evaluate their access and actually start removing or requesting new roles based on where they are. But we'll get to that here in a little bit. So I'm not going to create a new group right now because I'm going to jump over to a group that I already have created, a dynamic student group. So this group I populated just based off of the student flag. It populated 25 members. All of these people that have been added to this group are all students. And you'll notice that one of the options I have is licenses. So if I head on over to this, I can assign a license to this user. And in my case, I only have A5s. So I can assign an A5 license, select specific ones so I can take off things, right? If you don't want them to have access to do or bookings, you can take that off. And once you've done this, you would hit save. This might break it because they already have student licensing assigned, but we'll see what happens. So you see licensing assignments succeeded. So if I go back to the dynamic student group, under licenses, now the A5 license is assigned to this group. So any students that are dynamically added to this group will automatically have the A5 licenses or the A3 licenses or whatever type of licenses added to this group automatically. So I think that answers the question of what the flow is. This is what we think is the easiest way to approach this. There are ways of doing the exact same thing in PowerShell. And I believe we have some documentation on that. Yes, Mike, correct. We're transitioning over to a unified SKU or have already transitioned over to a unified SKU. As long as you update that SKU, your current process should still work. So through the GUI, this is the easiest way. You create dynamic student groups and you base it off of whatever. I'm doing job title because that's what's in my demo tenant, but you can base it off of whatever unique identifier flags students or flags whatever group you're talking about. And whenever someone is onboarded into that group, they would be assigned the license. When they're offboarded from that group, they will be the license will be removed. So great questions. And that was a really great segue into groups. So within overarching groups, and I see that we're a little low on time. So we have 3 setting areas that I'd like to talk about because I think they're really important, especially if you're leveraging teams in your environment. The first one is general, and this isn't super important, but it's good to know it's here because things like users can create security groups in Azure portals, API, or PowerShell. Turning this off or on is going to be a good choice for you. Allowing people to manage membership in the access panel, things like that. Just make sure you go through this, and these are all set to things that you want them to be set to. The 2 important ones, expiration and naming policy. So you can set group expiration policies because what has happened with teams, I've seen it a lot, is Teams is exciting, and if you give your organization the ability to create teams, all of a sudden overnight, you may have gone from no M365 groups or a handful to 1,000, right? Because people just love to create teams, and they create test teams, and then those test teams aren't what they want, so they just say forget it and they move on to another team. What you can do is you can set lifetimes. So these can be the fewest 30 and upwards of, it's ridiculous. I was messing around and putting in a whole bunch of 9s and it just wasn't shutting down, but I think at a certain point it just doesn't apply. I believe 2 years would probably be about the most anyone would do, but you can customize the amount of time in days since the last time this group was accessed, where the group will be retired. And you'll get notifications 30 days, 15 days, and 1 day advanced sent to the owner. If the group does not have an owner, you can specify an email contact here. Typically, people do their help desk admin account, so helpdesk at whatever. And then you can either apply this to all M365 groups or only selected ones. This is really, really important to keep M365 group sprawl to a minimum. Because I promise you, when you turn on Teams for your environment, people are going to really explore and set up groups and get away from it and leave this team and start going all over the board. So having some type of expiration policy in place will just keep your headache to a minimum, because the automated process will start taking care of a lot of groups. The only way that this group will not be deleted is if someone makes an actionable, if they say go in and say, no, don't delete this, or someone goes in and touches it. So if a owner or a user goes in and starts accessing information, the counter starts over. The other component is naming policy. This is huge in high ed, but also in K-12s and K-12s that are allowing maybe students to create, maybe high school students to create groups or teams, because you can prevent block, or you can upload a CSV that has specific words that cannot be included in a team name. Things we've seen before are the principal's name, bad words, things that are specific to your university. So you don't want things or people to be tricked, right? So like HR, finance, business, whatever. You can take those items out, and you can also set a group naming policy. So you can add a prefix, which could be a string, right? So like it'll automatically put on the company that person's from. This says company. I think maybe office would be better, right? So maybe they come from the business office. You can put a office flag in front and then the group name, and you can even add a suffix. But it can't just be a string, right? You can just put whatever you want, right? So you can put test here, and it'll always put test at the end. This is really great if you're trying to make sure a naming convention happens that is standard, and you can either put a prefix or a suffix on that. So two things that we've seen are just so helpful. Other things in groups settings, you'll notice I have access reviews and privileged access groups. These are a way of, again, providing just-in-time access for specific groups. And if you have Azure AD Premium P2, you can leverage those items. So if I jump over, what I really want to talk about, well, no, we should still cover Azure AD roles and administration. I'm getting ahead of myself. We talked a lot about users, we talked about groups, we've talked about assigning licenses to groups, we've talked about how dynamic groups work. One thing that all of this, though, revolves around is roles. We are a firm believer, and it's not going away anytime soon, of role-based access control. This means that you are providing a specific role to someone that does a specific thing. So if I jump in here, these are all of our pre-created roles, and you can create custom roles, pre-created roles. If I was to jump in here and go to a common run like help desk administrator, if I go here, one, you'll see who's been assigned to that role. So for me personally, I have an admin security group tier 2 that is assigned the help desk administrator role. You'll notice I have a lot of extra fields though, right? I have end time, start time, state. Those are all that privileged identity management from PIM, where you are able to set access to a specific role for a specific set of time or permanent. So you can make sure that this specific group only has it maybe for the week that they're doing onboarding or for the month that they're doing some type of transition, and then it will automatically remove it from them. But the more important parts about these roles is roles setting. Sorry, description. Description is where you will see specifically what this role grants access to. And this is key because a lot of times admins will grant a role without really realizing the spread of it. And that's key in the read permissions. So at the top, you'll see the real permissions that set this apart from other groups. So Help Desk Administrator allows reset passwords for all users, read and configure Azure Service Health, create and manage Office 365 support tickets. But then it has this host of basic read permissions. So they can't do anything, but they can see all of this information. So as you're making these decisions on what role to assign to a specific person or a specific group, make sure you're coming in here and reading through the description to understand what you are providing this group of individuals. And then role settings, as I was talking about before, this is going to go through a lot of additional features. A lot of this, again, is A5 specific because it talks about assignment, how long assignment lasts, where notifications are sent. But again, if all of this is editable, if you have that P2 level, and you can configure all of these different settings to match what you want it to match. Okay, looking at time, we talked a little bit about administrative units. The important thing here is, especially for K-12s, as this begins to become more and more fleshed out, because it is still relatively new, but it's moving in the direction that we want to take it, where it's giving you more ability to manage more granular control, or giving you the ability to provide more granular control to manage separate entities that are really one entity, which exists in K-12s, in separate schools, in high ed, in separate colleges that are decentralized. Administrative units is going to be, I think, what's going to be really helpful moving forward, because you'll be able to assign a help desk administrator role to an administrative unit that gives specific people the ability to manage a specific group, but only that group. And that's really important, I think, especially in the education space. What I want to jump into are going to be the last two components. This is going to be enterprise applications. So talking about how you can leverage all of this great Azure AD Connect, password pass-through authentication, and actually put it to use for enterprise applications or even homegrown applications to move a lot of the authentication work off of your on-prem environment and into Azure AD. So enterprise applications. These are going to be applications that have been published by the company into Azure to allow you to be able to configure something or a connection very simply. So if I jump over to new applications, you'll notice the Azure AD gallery is going to have a lot of applications already built in. Things like Slack, Workday, if you're using that for your HR platform. Google is a huge one. SAP, Oracle, all of these, again, are going to be synchronized to Azure AD very easily because it's already built in. So all you have to do is click on one of them and provide the relevant reply URLs and custom domains to your environment to allow the connection to happen. And we have tons of documentation online. If this is a route you want to go, we have documentation over every single one of these. However, if you have an application that you've created or a web app that you host, there are ways of still leveraging Azure AD for authentication for those specifically. The two routes you can go are app registration, which an app registration basically establishes your app and URL within Azure AD so that whenever someone tries to authenticate to it, it kicks it over to Azure AD for authentication. The person is either allowed or denied, and then they're able to continue on again if they're allowed. But we also have something new called App Proxy. And this allows you to, quote unquote, project your on-premise application into the portal, which then allows it to have modern authentication practices taking place on it. So you have a legacy system that you've created. As long as you can use SAML 2.0, you can bring that into Azure AD and, quote unquote, bring it into, because you actually deploy an agent to that box, and it will allow people to authenticate into that service via Azure AD, which removes the need for VPNs. And I know there's tons of other reasons to use VPNs, but this is one way to at least alleviate one of those use cases. What this also allows you to do with enterprise applications, and I'll illustrate that. I have a Google Apps for Education. What this allows you to do is set conditional access policies. And that's a great segue into the next section, security. Conditional access policies is how we enforce multi-factor authentications or user access from specific locations. Conditional access is at the heart of all of our Azure AD security. What conditional access lets you do is create a policy. I'm just going to go ahead and run through a policy here really quickly. Create a policy, whether that's user-based or device-based, and apply it to a specific user or groups of users, and extend it to a specific application that you've created, specific locations, or even just applying MFA. And it says, basically, if I go in here and configure one really quickly, we're going to say for all users, for all cloud apps or select apps, but I'm going to do for all cloud apps conditions. You have these conditions. So it can be based off user risk. That is an Azure AD Premium P2 component, but risk profiles where you're letting the machine learning component take over and say whether or not this is a risky user based on their baseline or a strange sign-in. Or you can say based on whether or not this device is compliant with Intune, whether this device is registered to Intune, is it coming to us from a known location or a known IP range? So what we're going to do is do user risk high. Why not? Configure yes, hit high, hit done. So now my condition is it is a very risky sign-in attempt. What do you want to happen? And that's when we get into access controls. So we've said whenever our users are logging into any cloud app with a high risk profile, what do we want to happen? You can straight up block access. You can say they can't touch anything, and they'll get a little thing that says, sorry, your access has been blocked. Please contact your IT administration group. Is that a good route to take? Maybe not. You might get a lot of angry calls, but what you can do is you can grant access with conditions. So you can say they can still log in. However, they need to use multi-factor authentication, or they can still log in, but only if they're logging in from a device that is compliant and Azure AD joined. Or yes, they can log in. However, I'm going to require multi-factor authentication and require them to do a password change. But that only works if you have password write-back set up in your environment. But this is where conditional access starts really coming into play. So you've got your users in your environment, you have your devices in your environment, and you have security groups created, and even enterprise applications authenticating off Azure. What that allows you to do is control how your user is logging in. So you're securing the identity. You're saying, I know my user is probably going to be accessing computers from random locations because that's just how users interact. However, I'm saying, so if a user all of a sudden is trying to access our financial platform from a public device that looks like it's in New York at the public library for some reason, that's random. That's a high user risk. We're still going to let them log in. However, we're going to require multi-factor, even if they've done the trust for 60 days. Still going to require multi-factor, and we're going to make sure that they do a password change as well. And then you can go even further and start controlling things based on a session, a specific session. And this is a whole nother conversation, and there's some really great resources out there. I just don't think we had enough time to dive into it. But you can control per app specific items. So, okay, we've granted them control, but now in that session, I'm going to be able to reach into Google Apps and say, because of the access or the way you are accessing, I am not going to let you download anything from your Google Apps environment. I'm not going to let you download anything from your Box environment. I'm not going to let you access this secure environment of SharePoint because the way you logged into this was not secure. So that's how you can start using conditional access policy to secure your environment in a pretty new way. Jumping back over to security, I know I've gone way over, but I can stay a little longer to answer some questions. Identity Secure Score is a great place to start understanding where you stand in your environment from an Azure AD point of view. What this does is it's giving you your score. Mine's really low, out of 100. And it's telling you how you rank compared to other institutions of your size. And then it will give you, here are the things that you can do to improve your score, to become more secure. And you can click on any one of these and it will tell you exactly what to do. And then you can actually mark it as, I'm going to address this. I'm accepting the risk. I know this is a problem, but we do something differently, so we're not going to handle it that way, whether it's planned or resolved through alternate mitigation. And then it will give you a boost of whatever percentage, with the idea that we're kind of gamifying identity and security to try to get you to that 100%, get you as close to being fully secure as possible. A lot of these are going to have massive impacts, right? 17%, I don't have MFA secure deployed to my administrative roles. Well, if I do that, I get a 17% increase. And it also lets you know what type of user impact and implementation costs it will have on your environment. The other thing that I want to call into play is going to be risky users and risky sign-ins. Again, this is an Azure AD Premium P2, but I think it's worth calling out because we talked a little bit about it during conditional access. This is what allows you to understand what risk or what is qualifying as a risk for that specific user. I don't have any right now, but risky users are going to be users that are accessing information or trying to log in from a location that's not normal, or just going outside of their baseline risk profile. This profile is constantly being changed. So you will get a risky sign-in detection or risk detection, and it says, hey, check this out. And you can say, yes, this user was compromised and go through the steps of mitigating, or you can say, no, we know this user was traveling to Greece. We know that's why they're logging in from a Greek-based IP location, and you can dismiss it. When you dismiss it, it changes the risk profile of that person and says, okay, this person has visited Greece before, so if they do it again in the future, it's going to be less risky. Not maybe remove all risk, but we just know that this is something this user does. So again, it builds in a level of artificial intelligence to help you understand what's really happening in your environment. I don't want to take up too much more time. I've already used up so much. So I'm going to run through any questions that I see, and I see a lot. That's awesome. Let's see, Scott, can a user be assigned to a role that allows them to reset specific groups of user passwords? Scott, yes and no. You can assign someone to an administrative unit that has access to a specific set of users that allows them to then manage that specific set of users and their passwords. So it's not a specific role. You'd have to leverage administrative units. Is there a way to set up a group? Okay, Daniel, as of right now, no, that is not something that can be configured, but we are making a lot of changes to Azure AD where I think if we had this conversation in about a year, that will be different because we're introducing the idea of having multiple domains and subdomains and how you can manage those in a way that is very similar to that administrative unit environment. But if you can build out an administrative unit or build out a dynamic group that has a subset of students in it based on flags, you can then start managing that group again via administrative units. Am I able to select specific OUs to sync using the sync tool? Yes, great call out, Craig. The sync tool can sync specific OUs, whether that's user OUs or device OUs. This is great for testing. So say you have your production Azure environment and a test environment, and you want to just test out IT devices and IT users to just understand how to use it before you throw everyone up there and it's Wild West, right? What you can do is in that Azure AD Connect tool, it will ask you, are you syncing your entire organization or specific OUs? Make sure you select specific OUs and you can go in and select. And if you want to change that in the future, you go through the same tool configuration and just select new OUs or move it to the organizational level. Daniel, thank you for the enterprise application +1. I appreciate that. I'm glad it's working for you. It is something that we're introducing new features to constantly. And the app proxy, I think, is the biggest game changer because that, again, allows you educational institutions. I remember I had so many when I was at A&M. We had all of these on-premise applications that were reliant upon very old ways of authenticating. The more you can move towards a modern authentication method, the more you can start assigning those conditional access policies we talked about to give them a better environment or better feel and secure that identity to make sure that the app is staying safe. Does this also work with the corporate Microsoft Store? Mike, are you referring to applications that are published in the Microsoft Store? If yes, no. These are going to be applications, web-based applications that are specific to your user's environment. This would be things, again, like an HR system. This would be things like Google Apps, Box, even your LMS can be authenticated. One thing I do want to call out, because that did remind me, thank you, under enterprise applications, we now have the ability, if I jump in again to my Google Apps, you now have the ability for provisioning. This is huge. This is actually an article that I will send y'all. What you can now do is you can incorporate the lifecycle management that you currently have in place on premise and bring that into the cloud. So maybe you have a lifecycle management process that already grants access to Google Apps, or you want to have that type of flow. You can now do that. So you can incorporate, it's not all identity lifecycle management platforms, but you can now start bringing some of that provisioning capability into enterprise applications as well. And I'm saying enterprise applications. When you do an app registration or an app proxy, that application does, for all intents and purposes, become an enterprise application that you can then apply all of these different conditional access policies to. So publishing applications to the store using Azure AD. Still not necessarily. Where we typically see people publishing applications would be to, if you're using Intune, you would have the ability to use Company Portal and deploy applications that are compliant in your environment or okay for your users to use or download. We see them going the Company Portal route. I do believe there is a component to where you can allow users to publish to the company store, but that's a different process and not included in Azure AD. But Mike, if you're interested in Intune, it does have a company portal that is very similar to like Desktop Central's kind of cases. I don't think they really have one anymore, but it allows you to publish apps that users can then install if they want. So really great. Deploying software MSI only or .exe as well. If we're talking Intune, you can do both. It's just a different process. MSI is a little bit more straightforward. However, you can do .exe, but I believe you have to create your own configuration for it. So you would actually deploy a script that would then deploy the .exe. But we're working on that. We have an Intune in development page. That's a docs page that actually has some updates on that as well. And Intune is not my specialty, but it's definitely, I think they actually do some Intune webinars as well. We've gone over 2 minutes. Thank you so much. Are there any other questions? Again, all of the links that you'll have, I'll make sure you get. There's so much that we didn't even have time to get into, but I think we covered a lot of the basics. The information that I'll send your way will have a lot of ways to get more involved or start deploying a lot of the things we talked about. If you're brand new, again, to reiterate, if you're brand new to the Azure AD environment, Azure AD Connect is going to be your best friend. Test that out. Start creating groups and start creating those conditional access policies to force things like MFA to start securing your users a little better. It's been a pleasure. Thank you all so much for your time. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week and weekend.
Yes, thank you, Ryan. Thank you, everyone, for attending. My name is Margie. I'm a Education Customer Success Manager with Microsoft, and we appreciate Ryan sharing with us and all the amazing tips and tricks and just walkthrough of Azure Active Directory. I have been dropping a few links into the chat. So the first link, and I shared it again, was for any survey feedback that you have for suggestions for future IT topics. We'd love to make sure we keep delivering topics that are useful to you in the IT world. So let us know what topics you'd like to see in the future. And then we also, from Microsoft, offer free end user training. So we get your users comfortable with using Teams, OneDrive, OneNote, you name it. If it's in Microsoft 365, we probably have a training for it to help your end users feel comfortable. So I shared my colleague's email, Melanie. Please take note of that. Even if you're not the person who coordinates training, pass her name and email along to your IT or your training coordinators or your tech kind of people who do that for your either district or your school. We'd love to be connected. And this also applies to higher education as well. So if you're at the post-secondary level and you have faculty and administrators who need training, we're happy to help there as well. So please let us know. With that, though, we'll be ending this. As Ryan has shared, we will be sending along some links. So Stephen from OETC will get those links and share those along. This has been recorded as well, and that will be shared on the OET site. So with that, everyone have a great day. If you're in the Pacific Northwest, stay cool, and we'll see you you for the next one. We do have another session next week. Or no, sorry, in 2 weeks. Sorry, enjoy next week as a holiday. In 2 weeks on understanding school data sync and LMS working together. So hopefully we'll see you back on July 13th for that. With that, everyone, take care. Bye-bye.